Behind the gilded halls of Europe's greatest palaces lies a truth so disturbing that historians have whispered about it for centuries: the systematic sacrifice of royal daughters on the altar of dynastic purity. These were not marriages. They were genetic experiments conducted on living women, orchestrated by families who valued bloodline over humanity. For over 1,000 years, royal families across Europe, Egypt, and beyond practiced what they euphemistically called keeping the blood pure. Fathers married daughters to uncles. Sisters were wed to brothers. Cousins were paired like breeding stock. The women at the center of these unions weren't consulted. They were commanded. Isabella II of Spain spent her childhood knowing she would marry her first cousin. Maria Re of Portugal was betrothed to her uncle when she was just 6 years old. These weren't isolated incidents but systematic practices that spanned continents and centuries. Each princess who walked down the aisle toward a blood relative was walking toward a fate worse than most could imagine. The consequences were as predictable as they were horrific. Miscarriages plagued these unions like clockwork. Children born of these marriages often died in infancy, their bodies too weak to survive the genetic lottery their parents had forced upon them. Those who lived faced lives of illness, deformity, and mental anguish. Yet the practice continued generation after generation. Why? Because to these royal houses, women were not individuals with hopes and dreams. They were vessels for preserving power. Their bodies were political tools, their wombs state property. The crown's obsession with purity created a cult of bloodline worship that destroyed countless lives. Today, we pull back the velvet curtains and expose the truth. This is not just history. It's a warning about what happens when power demands absolute control over women's bodies. The princesses trapped in these unions may have worn crowns, but they were prisoners in golden cages. What you're about to learn will challenge everything you thought you knew about royal romance and fairy tale endings. These are the stories they didn't want you to know. The princesses whose lives were sacrificed for a bloodline that was already poisoned from within. The obsession with royal bloodline purity didn't emerge from nowhere. It was cultivated like a religion, complete with its own twisted theology. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs believed they descended from gods, and marrying outside the family would dilute their divine essence. This belief spread like a contagion through royal courts across the world. By the Middle Ages, European royalty had adopted this practice with fervor. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled vast swaths of Europe, turned inbreeding into an art form. They created elaborate family trees that looked more like family circles, with the same names appearing as both ancestors and descendants. Charles II of Spain, the ultimate product of Habsburg inbreeding, had an ancestry so tangled that he was more inbred than if his parents had been siblings. The political machinery that enforced these unions was ruthless. Young princesses were groomed from birth to accept their fate. They were taught that their highest duty was to preserve the family's power, even if it meant marrying men who shared their blood. Resistance was not just discouraged, it was unthinkable. These girls were raised in isolation, surrounded by courtiers who reinforced the message, your body belongs to the crown. The Catholic Church, despite its official prohibition of incest, often turned a blind eye when it came to royalty. All dispensations could be purchased, allowing cousins to marry with the Church's blessing. The very institution that should have protected these women instead became complicit in their exploitation. Money and power spoke louder than scripture. The medical establishment of the time primitive as it was began to notice patterns. Royal physicians documented the Habsburg jaw, the protruding lower jaw that became more pronounced with each generation of inbreeding. They recorded the high infant mortality rates, the frequent miscarriages, the mysterious illnesses that plagued royal children. Yet they dared not speak too loudly about the cause. Behind closed doors, these royal women suffered in ways that history has only recently begun to acknowledge. Their letters, when they survived, speak of loneliness, fear, and resignation. They knew their children would likely die young or live with disabilities. They understood that their own health would deteriorate with each pregnancy. Yet they had no choice but to continue. The cult of pure blood demanded sacrifices, and it was always the women who paid the price. While kings and princes could take mistresses and father healthy children outside of marriage, queens and princesses were bound to their blood relatives, their bodies policed and controlled to ensure the purity of the legitimate line. No royal family exemplified the horrors of systematic inbreeding more than the Habsburgs. For nearly 500 years, they ruled vast territories across Europe, and for nearly all of that time they married within their own bloodline. The results were catastrophic, creating what historians now call the Habsburg curse, a legacy of genetic destruction that serves as history's starkest warning about the price of obsessive endogamy. The practice began innocently enough, with strategic marriages between distant cousins to consolidate power. But as the generations passed, the family tree became increasingly gnawed. By the 16th century, Habsburg marriages were essentially genetic Russian roulette. Philip II of Spain married his niece, Anna of Austria. Their son, Philip III, married Margaret of Austria, his second cousin. Their son, Philip IV, married Marana of Austria, who was both his second cousin and his niece. The women in these unions bore the heaviest burden. Mariana of Austria gave birth to 5 children with Philip IV. Only 2 survived to adulthood. Her letters reveal a woman broken by loss, watching child after child succumb to genetic disorders that the court physicians couldn't explain. She knew something was wrong with these marriages, writing to her confessor about her unnatural fears. During each pregnancy, Margaret Teresa of Spain represents perhaps the most tragic example. Married to her uncle, Leopold I at age 15, she was essentially a child bride sacrificed to maintain Habsburg control over the Spanish throne. Contemporary portraits show a young woman with the distinctive Habsburg features, the protruding jaw, the drooping lower lip, but also something else, eyes that seem to hold a terrible knowledge. Margaret Teresa's short life was a succession of pregnancies and losses. Of her 4 children, only 1 survived to adulthood. She died at 21. Her body destroyed by the genetic burden she carried and passed on. Her death was officially attributed to complications from childbirth, but modern genetic analysis suggests she likely suffered from multiple hereditary conditions that made pregnancy especially dangerous. The Habsburg women weren't just victims of their genes. They were victims of a system that viewed them as breeding stock. Court protocols dictated every aspect of their lives, from what they ate to whom they could speak with. They were surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who reported their every move, ensuring they remained faithful to husbands who were often their uncles or first cousins. The ultimate product of this genetic catastrophe was Charles II of Spain, whose family tree was so intertwined that he had only 4 great-grandparents instead of the usual 8. His mother, Mariana of Austria, was also his father's niece. Charles was born with such severe disabilities that he couldn't speak until age 4 or walk until age 8. His death without heirs finally ended the Habsburg line in Spain, but not before countless women had been sacrificed to maintain it. Among the many tragic figures in this dark history, Maria I of Portugal stands out as particularly heartbreaking. Known to history as Maria the Mad, her story illustrates how the combination of inbreeding and the pressure of royal duty could destroy not just bodies, but minds. Her descent into madness wasn't just personal tragedy, was the inevitable result of generations of incestuous unions. Maria was born in 1734 into a family already weakened by centuries of intermarriage. The Portuguese royal family, like their Spanish cousins, believed that marrying within the family would strengthen their claim to the throne. Maria's own parents were closely related and the genetic dice were already loaded against her from birth. At age 25, Maria married her uncle Pedro III. The 17-year age gap was the least of their problems. Pedro was her father's brother, making their children genetically equivalent to the offspring of half-siblings. The Portuguese court celebrated the marriage as a triumph of dynastic planning. No one spoke of the young woman who had been given no choice in the matter. Maria's early years as queen showed a intelligent, devout woman trying to rule effectively. She patronized the arts, reformed the prison system, and showed genuine concern for her subjects. But beneath the crown, the genetic time bomb was ticking. She suffered multiple miscarriages, and of the 7 children who survived birth, several showed signs of the family's hereditary weaknesses. The death of her eldest son, Jose, marked the beginning of Maria's psychological unraveling. Jose had married his aunt, Maria's sister, continuing the family tradition. When he died at 27, followed shortly by her daughter and son-in-law, who were also first cousins, something inside Maria broke. The weight of generations of unnatural unions seemed to crash down upon her all at once. Contemporary accounts describe a woman transformed by grief and madness. Maria would wander the palace halls at night, screaming about damnation and begging forgiveness for unnamed sins. She became convinced that she was destined for hell, that her whole family was cursed. In her moments of clarity, she would speak of the poison in our blood, perhaps understanding on some level what modern science would later confirm. The court physicians tried everything: bleeding, purging, ice baths, isolation. Nothing worked. Maria's screams echoed through the palace of Quuz, a sound that Quarters described as the voice of centuries of sin. She would refuse to sign state documents, convinced that her signature would damn her soul. She saw demons in the shadows and heard the voices of her dead children accusing her of murder. What makes Maria's case particularly tragic is that she seemed to understand in her madness truths that the sane world around her refused to acknowledge. Her ravings about poison, blood, cursed children, and divine punishment for unnatural acts weren't entirely wrong. They were simply expressed in the language of religious terror rather than genetic science. Marie Louise of Austria's story represents a different kind of horror, not the slow genetic destruction of the Habsburgs or the madness of Maria the Fur, but the cold, calculated use of a young woman's body for political gain. Born into the Habsburg family in 1791, Marie Louise was raised with one purpose: to be traded for power when the moment was right. That moment came in 1810 when Napoleon Bonaparte, having divorced Josephine for her failure to produce an heir, needed a wife of royal blood. The Austrian court, defeated in war and desperate for peace, offered up their 18-year-old archduchess like a sacrifice to appease a conqueror. Marie Louise had been raised to despise Napoleon as the enemy of everything her family stood for. Now she was told she would share his bed. The negotiations for this marriage were conducted with all the warmth of a livestock auction. Napoleon's representatives inspected portraits, inquired about Marie Louise's health, her fertility, her docility. They wanted assurances that she came from good breeding stock. Ironic given the Habsburg history, Marie Louise herself was not consulted. Her father, Emperor Francis I, simply informed her of her duty. Marie Louise's letters from this period reveal a young woman in terror. She wrote to her childhood governess about nightmares where Napoleon appeared as a monster. She had heard stories of his temper, his previous wife's suffering, his countless mistresses. But her protests fell on deaf ears. Her father told her that the sacrifice of one princess could save an empire. The proxy marriage ceremony conducted before Marie Louise had even met Napoleon exemplified the dehumanization of royal women. She stood in a Viennese chapel while her uncle stood in for Napoleon, speaking vows on behalf of a man thousands of miles away. By law, she was now married to someone she had never seen in person. Her body, her future, her potential children all had been signed away without her consent. When Marie Louise finally met Napoleon, she found not a monster but something perhaps worse. A man who saw her primarily as a broodmare. Napoleon was obsessed with producing an heir, and Marie Louise understood that her value to him depended entirely on her ability to conceive. The pressure was enormous. The entire French court watched her monthly cycles, whispered about every sign of potential pregnancy. Marie Louise did produce the heir Napoleon craved, Napoleon II, born in 1811. But even this triumph came with its own horrors. The birth was extremely difficult, and at one point the doctors asked Napoleon whether they should save the mother or the child. His response was telling: save the mother. She can give me more children. Marie Louise survived, but she never forgot that moment when her life was weighed against her reproductive potential. After Napoleon's fall, Marie Louise's story took another dark turn. The Congress of Vienna, carving up Napoleon's empire, decided her fate without consulting her. She was forbidden from following her husband into exile, separated from him permanently. Her son was taken from her and raised in Austria as a Habsburg prince, denied even his father's name. Marie Louise was given the Duche of Palmer as a consolation prize, a golden cage where she lived out her days. Neither widow nor wife, her life forever defined by a marriage she never wanted. The practice of royal inbreeding might seem like a relic of the distant past, but its echoes persist in isolated communities around the world. The Whitaker family of Odd, West Virginia has become infamous as America's most inbred family. Their story a stark reminder that the horrors of forced endogamy didn't end with the fall of royal houses. Hidden in the Appalachian Mountains, the Whitas represent what happens when isolation, poverty, and family tradition create a closed genetic loop. Discovered by photographer Mark Leiter in 2004, the family shocked the world with the visible evidence of generations of inbreeding. Unable to speak in conventional language, communicating through grunts and gestures, some family members bear physical markers reminiscent of the Habsburg jaw and other royal deformities. What makes the Whitaker case particularly disturbing is not just the genetic damage, but the system that perpetuated it. Like royal families of old, the Whitacres were trapped by tradition and isolation. The women in the family especially had little choice in their partners. Geographic isolation meant that potential mates were almost always blood relatives. Poverty meant that leaving was nearly impossible. The parallels to imprisoned princesses in European palaces are unmistakable. Even more shocking is the case from Australia that emerged in 2012. In rural New South Wales, authorities discovered a family of 38 members living in squalor, the product of 4 generations of incest. The matriarch, given the pseudonym Betty Cult by the courts, had created a closed family system where brothers married sisters, uncles paired with nieces, fathers with daughters. The children found in the compound couldn't speak properly, had severe physical deformities, and didn't know basic facts about the outside world. The Australian case revealed something crucial: the mindset that enabled systematic inbreeding. Betty Colt ruled her family like a queen, deciding who would pair with whom, isolating her descendants from outside influence. She created a cult of family where loyalty meant accepting whatever unions she decreed. The women and girls in this family were as trapped as any Habsburg princess, their bodies controlled by a matriarch, obsessed with keeping everything within the bloodline. These modern cases strip away the glamour of crowns and palaces, to reveal the raw horror of forced inbreeding. Without the veneer of royal tradition, we see these practices for what they truly are: systems of control that sacrifice women's autonomy and children's health for the sake of maintaining power within a closed group. The psychological damage in these modern cases mirrors what we can infer about historical royal women. Depression, anxiety, and trauma are endemic. The women know their children will likely suffer, yet they have no power to break the cycle. They're trapped between family loyalty and maternal instinct, forced to participate in a system that guarantees suffering for their offspring. What's particularly chilling is how these modern cases help us understand the historical ones. When we see the Whittaker family's living conditions, we are reminded that royal palaces were just gilded versions of the same prison. When we read about the cult family's indoctrination, we understand how royal women were similarly programmed from birth to accept their fate. Modern genetic science has finally given us the tools to understand the full scope of the medical horrors inflicted by systematic inbreeding. DNA analysis of royal remains has revealed a catalog of genetic disasters that would have made these women's lives a constant torment of physical and mental anguish. The Habsburg jaw, that protruding mandible that became the family's trademark, was just the visible tip of a genetic iceberg. This condition, known medically as mandibular prognathism, made eating difficult and speaking painful, but it was often accompanied by a host of other maxillofacial deformities that historical portraits politely minimized. These women struggled with chronic pain, difficulty breathing, and constant infections in an era before antibiotics. Hydrophilus, or water on the brain, appeared with alarming frequency in inbred royal lines. Princesses would give birth to babies with grotesquely enlarged heads, knowing these children were doomed to short, agonizing lives. The emotional trauma of repeatedly bearing such children and being forced to continue trying is almost impossible to imagine. Queen Maria Luisa of Spain lost multiple children to this condition, each death pushing her deeper into depression. Hemophilia, the royal disease, spread through European royal families like wildfire because of inbreeding. While this bleeding disorder primarily affected males, the women were carriers who lived with the constant fear of passing it to their sons. Every pregnancy was a game of genetic roulette. Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, herself the product of generations of royal intermarriage, watched her son Alex suffer from hemophilia and blamed herself for his condition until her dying day. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was the infertility that plagued these unions. Modern studies show that children of first cousins have significantly higher rates of infertility, and the problem compounds with each generation. Royal women faced enormous pressure to produce heirs, yet their own genetics often made this impossible. They endured countless pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or stillbirth, each loss a personal tragedy and a political crisis. The mental health consequences were equally devastating. Modern analysis suggests that the madness of Maria Furs of Portugal wasn't just psychological. It had a genetic component. Furia, a group of genetic disorders that can cause psychiatric symptoms, ran through royal bloodlines. Women suffering from these conditions were labeled as hysterical or mad, subjected to brutal treatments that only worsened their suffering. Autoimmune disorders flourished in these closed genetic pools. Royal women suffered from mysterious illnesses that left them bedridden for months, their immune systems attacking their own bodies. In an era when female complaints were often dismissed as hysteria, these women endured very real physical agony that medicine couldn't explain or treat. The skeletal deformities common in inbred populations meant that many royal women lived with chronic pain. Scoliosis, hip dysplasia, and other bone conditions made movement agonizing, yet they were expected to maintain perfect royal bearing, to dance at balls, to endure long ceremonial functions. Their portraits show them standing tall and regal. Their private letters speak of agony that never ended. To understand the ancient roots of royal incest, we must travel back to Tamiic Egypt and the most famous product of systematic inbreeding, Cleopatra VII. Far from the exotic beauty of Hollywood legend. Cleopatra was the culmination of 300 years of sibling marriage, a tradition that makes even the Habsburgs look restrained by comparison. The Tic dynasty, founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, adopted the Egyptian pharaonic tradition of sibling marriage with enthusiasm. For the Ptolemies, this wasn't just about keeping power in the family, it was about becoming gods. Egyptian theology held that the pharaoh was divine and divinity could only mate with divinity. Who could be more divine than one's own sibling? Cleopatra's family tree is a nightmare of recursive loops. Her parents were likely siblings. Her grandparents were definitely siblings. Going back through the generations, the same names appear over and over. Ptolemy, Cleopatra, Bones, Arzino. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and occasionally for variety, double cousins married each other. The genetic lottery had been rigged for centuries, but it was the women of the dynasty who paid the highest price. Cleopatra II, who lived 2 centuries before the famous Cleopatra VII, exemplifies the horror. She was married first to her brother Ptolemy VI. When he died, she was married to her other brother Ptolemy VII. The second brother husband then also married her daughter, his niece, creating a menage an incestuous horror that tore Egypt apart in civil war. The Tic women weren't passive victims. They couldn't afford to be forced into these unnatural unions. They learned to fight with the only weapons available: poison, assassination, and manipulation. Cleopatra raised armies against her brother husband. Bones IV had her husband strangled. These women, trapped in a system that denied them basic human dignity, became as ruthless as their circumstances demanded. The famous Cleopatra VII inherited this legacy of blood and dysfunction. Modern historians, analyzing busts and coins from her era, note that she likely bore the physical marks of her inbred heritage. A hooked nose, a jutting chin, features that speak of centuries of genetic stagnation. But she also inherited the intelligence and ruthlessness that had allowed to women to survive in their twisted world. Cleopatra's relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony are often portrayed as great romances, but they should be understood in context. After a lifetime of being surrounded by brother husbands and uncle suitors, these Roman men must have seemed like escape routes. They were powerful men from outside the suffocating Ptolemaic bloodline, offering not just political alliance but genetic diversity. The death of Cleopatra and her son Caesarion marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty, but the Egyptian tradition of royal incest cast a long shadow. The practice had demonstrated that systematic inbreeding could maintain power for centuries at a terrible cost. The lesson wasn't lost on later royal houses who would adopt similar practices with similar results. What makes the Ptolemaic example so chilling is its duration. For 300 years, generation after generation of women were forced into these unions. They knew the history, saw the pattern of madness and murder that marked their family, yet were powerless to break the cycle. Each Cleopatra, each Bones, each Arzino was both victim and perpetrator, trapped in a system that demanded they sacrifice their children to the same fate they had endured. For centuries, the true horror of royal inbreeding was hidden behind a veil of propriety and propaganda. Court historians wrote sanitized accounts that focused on political alliances and dynastic glory, carefully omitting the screams from the birthing chambers, the malformed children hidden away in palace wings, the young women aged before their time by repeated genetic disasters. Only now, with modern science and changing social attitudes, can we fully understand what was done to these women. The complicity of medical professionals throughout history is particularly damning. Royal physicians saw the pattern but remained silent. Bound by their positions and perhaps by fear, they developed euphemisms for genetic disorders: weak constitution, delicate health, nervous disposition. They prescribed worthless treatments for conditions they must have known were hereditary. Their silence enabled the system to continue for generations. The role of royal advisors and courtiers was equally problematic. These were often intelligent, educated people who could see the consequences of inbreeding play out in real time. Yet they continued to arrange these marriages to pressure young women into accepting them, to celebrate the unions even as they produced one tragedy after another. The machinery of monarchy demanded its sacrifices, and everyone played their part. Religious institutions, which should have been moral guardians, instead provided theological cover for these practices. Papal dispensations for marriages between close relatives were sold like indulgences, turning the church into an enabler of genetic catastrophe. Priests and confessors who heard the anguished prayers of women forced to bear their uncles' children offered spiritual comfort while doing nothing to challenge the system that caused their suffering. The women themselves were silenced by layers of protocol and propaganda. Their letters were censored, their complaints dismissed as female hysteria. When they did speak out, their words were interpreted as madness or ingratitude. Maria I of Portugal's ravings about poisoned blood were treated as insanity rather than insight. The Habsburg women who wrote of their fears were told to trust in God and do their duty. But some voices did break through. Elizabeth of Bavaria, who married into the Habsburg family, wrote extensively about the cursed blood of European royalty. She refused to allow her daughters to be trapped in the same system, fighting against proposed marriages to relatives. Her resistance was seen as scandalous at the time, but she understood what others refused to acknowledge. The system was diseased at its core. Modern historians have finally begun to piece together the real stories from fragments of letters, medical records, and genetic analysis. What emerges is a picture of systematic abuse, disguised as tradition. These women were victims of what we would now recognize as reproductive coercion, forced to participate in genetic experiments that guaranteed suffering for themselves and their children. The silence is finally breaking, but it comes too late for the countless women who suffered. Each princess forced to marry her uncle, each queen who buried malformed children, each royal daughter sacrificed to maintain pure blood deserves to have her story told honestly. They were not willing participants in a grand tradition. They were victims of a system that valued bloodline purity over human dignity. The history of royal inbreeding stands as one of humanity's darkest examples of what happens when power supersedes basic human rights. These weren't abstract policies or distant political machinations. They were intimate violations that played out in bed chambers and birthing rooms, leaving a trail of broken bodies and shattered minds across centuries. The cost was always paid by women and children. While kings and princes made the decisions, negotiated the treaties, and arranged the marriages, it was their daughters, sisters, and wives who bore the physical consequences. They carried pregnancies they knew were likely doomed. They raised children whose suffering was encoded in their genes. They lived with the knowledge that their own bodies had become instruments of dynastic policy. What makes this history particularly relevant today is how it illuminates the dangers of any system that treats women's bodies as property. The royal families who practiced systematic inbreeding were extreme examples, but the underlying mindset that women's reproductive capacity belongs to family, state, or community rather than to themselves persists in many forms around the world. The genetic disasters that resulted from royal inbreeding also serve as a warning about the dangers of isolation and insularity. Whether in royal palaces or remote communities, when groups close themselves off and reject outside influence, women inevitably pay the price. The Whitakers of West Virginia and the cults of Australia show that these patterns repeat whenever isolation and control combine. Modern science has given us the tools to understand why inbreeding causes such devastating consequences. But the royal women who suffered didn't need DNA tests to know something was terribly wrong. They lived with the results every day. The children who couldn't breathe properly, the babies born with enlarged heads, the pregnancies that ended in blood and grief. Their lived experience was centuries ahead of scientific understanding. The end of most European monarchies' practice of close inbreeding didn't come from moral awakening but from practical necessity. The Habsburg line died out. The Spanish throne passed to a new dynasty. The cost had simply become too high to ignore. But for every Charles II whose deformities ended a dynasty, there were dozens of women whose suffering went unrecorded there, names forgotten by history. As we look back on this dark chapter, we must remember that these weren't distant historical figures but real women who loved their children, felt pain, experienced joy and sorrow. They deserve better than to be breeding stock in a genetic experiment. They deserve the right to choose their partners, to have healthy children, to live lives free from the shadow of inherited disease. Their stories remind us that whenever we allow power to override humanity, it's always the most vulnerable who suffer most. The palaces where these tragedies unfolded still stand, transformed into tourist attractions. Visitors admire the gilt and marble, the portraits and tapestries. But if those walls could speak, they would tell of generations of women sacrificed to an obsession with blood purity. They would echo with the cries of malformed infants, the weeping of mothers burying another child, the silence of young brides resigned to their fate. This is the true legacy of royal inbreeding, a warning written in blood and tears about what happens when human beings become tools of power rather than individuals worthy of dignity and choice.